Hey there, truth seekers. Today we're tackling something wild, and I mean wild. We're talking about 40 million people who just vanished. Poof. Gone. Between 1650 and 1700, Europe's population supposedly dropped from 100 million to 60 million. And here's the kicker. There's no major war, no plague outbreak, no documented disaster that could explain where an entire generation of humans disappeared. 2. And before you think this is just sloppy record-keeping, the same population black hole shows up simultaneously in Asia, the Middle East, and North America. So either every census taker on Earth had the same epic brain fart, or something absolutely catastrophic happened that somebody really, really didn't want us to remember. Now, I know what you're thinking. This sounds like conspiracy theory nonsense. And hey, maybe it is. But stick with me, because the evidence we're about to unpack is genuinely bizarre. We're talking about whole generations missing from birth records, cities built on top of impossibly advanced foundations, a global freeze that made summer feel like winter, and a suspiciously coordinated rewriting of history across every continent. It's like someone hit the reset button on human civilization and then scrubbed the hard drive. So before we dive into this rabbit hole, and trust me, it goes deep, smash that like button if you're ready for your brain to do some gymnastics, and drop a comment letting me know what country you're watching from. I'm genuinely curious who's brave enough to explore this with me. Ready to question everything you thought you knew about the 18th century? Let's go. So let's start with the numbers, because honestly, they're absolutely bonkers. Official demographic records from the 17th and 18th centuries contain what I can only describe as a statistical nightmare that historians tend to quietly shuffle past, hoping nobody notices. According to the data we have, and yes, these are actual historical records, not some random conspiracy theorist's fever dream, Europe's population in 1650 stood at roughly 100 million people. That's a nice round number, easy to remember. Now, fast forward 50 years to 1700, and suddenly we're looking at just 60 million people. 40 million humans just gone, disappeared, vanished into thin air like they were part of some cosmic magic trick. Except nobody's applauding because this is genuinely terrifying. And before you jump in with, well, obviously there was a war or a plague, let me stop you right there. That's the logical explanation, right? Except here's the problem. There's no documented conflict or epidemic anywhere close to the scale needed to wipe out 40% of an entire continent's population in just half a century. The Black Death in the 14th century. Now that was a population destroyer, killing somewhere between 75 and 200 million people worldwide over the course of several years. We have extensive records of that catastrophe. Mass graves, economic collapse, first-hand accounts of horror that would make a modern zombie movie look tame. But for this 1650 to 1700 period, crickets. Nothing. Just a casual loss of 40 million people that apparently nobody thought was worth writing home about. Which is weird, because you'd think someone might have mentioned it. Dear Diary, everyone's dead. Also, it rained today. Now you might be thinking this is just Europe being Europe. Maybe they had a really bad census taker. Or perhaps medieval record-keeping was about as reliable as your friend who says, "I'll text you back," and then doesn't respond for 3 weeks. But here's where it gets genuinely unsettling. This isn't just a European problem. When we look at demographic data from the same period in Asia, the Middle East, and North America, we see the exact same pattern. Populations that were thriving in the mid-1600s suddenly crash by the turn of the century, and then mysteriously bounce back in the 1720s. It's happening simultaneously across continents that, at the time, had minimal contact with each other. So either the entire world decided to collectively forget how to count people, or something profoundly strange happened that affected the entire planet. And spoiler alert, I'm leaning toward option 2. Let's dig into what the actual records tell us, because this is where things go from, that's odd, to, okay, what the hell is going on here? When researchers painstakingly examine surviving church records, and we're talking about baptism, registers, marriage certificates, burial logs, all the essential paperwork that churches maintained with obsessive detail, a shocking pattern emerges. Entire age groups are just missing from the data. Not underrepresented, not slightly reduced, completely absent. If you're looking for documentation of people born between roughly 1685 and 1705 in most major European cities, good luck finding it. It's like an entire generation got erased from existence, leaving behind what historians have come to call the lost generation. And unlike the term Ernest Hemingway popularized for World War I veterans, this lost generation isn't just metaphorically traumatized. They literally don't exist in the records. Tax registers from this period paint an equally bizarre picture. Medieval and early modern governments loved their taxes. It was basically their favorite hobby after warfare and religious persecution. They kept meticulous records of who owed what, when they paid, and what excuses they gave for not paying. "Sorry, Your Majesty, the plague took my cow," was apparently a valid reason for a tax extension. These registers are historical gold mines because they tracked families, occupations, property ownership, all the stuff that helps us understand who was living where and when. But when you examine the tax rolls from 1680 to 1720, there's this massive gap where an entire demographic should be. Young adults who should be paying taxes, getting married, inheriting property, starting businesses. They're nowhere to be found. Then suddenly, in the 1720s, boom, millions of new taxpayers appear out of nowhere, like they just spawned into existence. The government's response? "Welcome to the tax system, mysterious new citizens. Please remit payment promptly." Now let's talk about the usual suspects that historians like to blame when populations decline. First up, plague. The Great Plague of London in 1665 is well documented and genuinely horrific, killing an estimated 100,000 people in London alone. But, and this is a crucial but, it ended in 1666, and it was primarily confined to England. It didn't sweep across Europe, Asia, and the Americas simultaneously. It doesn't explain a 40 million person deficit that spans multiple continents over several decades. Plus, we have detailed records of the London plague, mass graves, quarantine measures, people painting red crosses on doors, Daniel Defoe writing about it later like it was the worst thing ever. For a population loss of this magnitude, you'd expect similar documentation everywhere. Instead, nothing. Just an eerie silence in the historical record, which is about as comforting as finding your house completely empty with all the lights on and dinner still warm on the table. What about war? Surely the 17th century had enough conflicts to explain this demographic disaster. The 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, was certainly devastating, killing approximately 8 million people through combat, disease, and famine. That's a staggering number, and it absolutely wrecked Central Europe. But, again with the but, it ended in 1648. That's before our mysterious population crash even begins. And while Europe kept itself busy with various smaller conflicts in the late 1600s, because apparently they just couldn't help themselves, none of them approached the scale necessary to erase 40 million people. The War of Spanish Succession started in 1701, which is after our demographic black hole, and even that conflict, which lasted over a decade, didn't produce casualties anywhere near this level. So we can't blame warfare, at least not any warfare that's documented in the historical record. Unless there was some kind of secret global conflict that everybody conveniently forgot to mention, which seems unlikely, but at this point, who knows? Famine is the next logical culprit. Historically, famines have been incredibly effective at decimating populations, often more so than war or disease. The Little Ice Age, which lasted from roughly 1300 to 1850, certainly created agricultural challenges across Europe and beyond. Shorter growing seasons, crop failures, livestock dying. It was not a great time to be a farmer, which is unfortunate because basically everyone was a farmer. But here's the thing. While the Little Ice Age created periodic food shortages throughout its duration, there's no documented famine in the late 1600s severe enough to kill 40 million people. We have records of famines from this era. The Great Famine of 1695 to 1697 in France and Scotland, for example. But they're regional disasters, not global apocalypses. And frankly, if there had been a famine capable of wiping out nearly half of Europe's population, contemporary sources would have been screaming about it from every church pulpit and royal court. Famine was dramatic. People noticed famine. They wrote about famine constantly, often in exhausting detail. The absence of such records is, in itself, deeply suspicious. So if plague, war, and famine don't explain the missing millions, what does? This is where conventional history starts nervously adjusting its collar and changing the subject. Because the truth is, historians don't have a good answer. Some try to explain it away as record-keeping errors, Maybe different regions counted their populations using different methods. Or perhaps the 1650 numbers were inflated, while the 1700 numbers were deflated. Basically, the equivalent of, "my dog ate my homework," but for demographers. The problem with this explanation is that it requires every single region across multiple continents to have made exactly the same error, in exactly the same direction, at exactly the same time. The odds of that happening naturally are roughly equivalent to you winning the lottery every day for a year straight. Possible? Technically. Likely? Not unless the universe has a really weird sense of humor. Then there's what I call the silent disaster theory. The idea that something catastrophic happened, but it was so traumatic that societies collectively chose not to document it or actively suppressed records of it. This actually has historical precedent. After major disasters, particularly those involving social collapse or mass casualties, communities sometimes engage in what's basically cultural amnesia. They don't talk about it, don't write about it, and eventually, the memory fades. But for this to work as an explanation, you'd need every major civilization on Earth to independently decide to forget about the same event at the same time. That's not just improbable. It suggests either an unprecedented level of psychological trauma or some form of coordinated information suppression. Neither option is particularly comforting. The most disturbing aspect of this demographic mystery isn't just the disappearance of 40 million people. It's the sudden reappearance of massive populations in the 1720s. Census data, tax records, and church registers all show a dramatic surge in population just 2 decades after the trough. Millions of people suddenly show up in the records, as if someone hit the respawn button on human civilization. Where did they come from? How did populations recover so quickly after such a catastrophic decline? Under normal circumstances, population recovery after a major demographic crisis takes generations. It took Europe over a century to recover from the Black Death. But somehow, between 1700 and 1730, cities that were supposedly decimated suddenly became bustling metropolises again. The official explanation is improved conditions and higher birth rates, which sounds reasonable until you actually do the math. For populations to bounce back that quickly, you'd need birth rates that would make rabbits look celibate by comparison. Every woman would need to be having children constantly. Infant mortality would need to drop to basically zero. And somehow, despite just experiencing whatever catastrophe killed 40 million people, economic and social conditions would need to be absolutely perfect for child rearing. Right, sure, totally plausible. What makes this even stranger is that many of these new residents in the 1720s don't seem to have local family connections. They appear in records as if from nowhere. No parents listed, no ancestral ties to the region, just suddenly there, working jobs, paying taxes, getting married, living their lives. It's like someone teleported millions of people into various cities across the world and said, "Okay, you live here now. Try to blend in." In normal demographic patterns, you can trace family lineages through records. The Smiths lived here for generations. The Johnsons moved here from that village. The Andersons came over from that other country. But for a significant portion of the 1720s population surge, those connections just aren't there. They exist in the records as fully formed adults with no documented history prior to their appearance. If you were designing a simulation and needed to quickly repopulate it after a crash, this is exactly what it would look like. Now, I'm not saying aliens did it or that we're living in a computer simulation that got rebooted in 1700. What I am saying is that something profoundly strange happened in the late 17th century. Something that affected the entire world, and somehow, almost all documentation of it has disappeared or been obscured. 40 million people don't just vanish without a trace. Populations don't crash and rebound in defiance of all demographic logic. Historical records don't develop convenient gaps covering the same period across multiple civilizations by accident. Either we're missing massive chunks of evidence, or someone worked very hard to make sure we'd never find it. And honestly, I'm not sure which option is more unsettling, that we lost the records through incompetence and chaos, or that someone deliberately erased them. Both scenarios suggest that our understanding of human history has some seriously problematic holes in it, and the late 1600s might be the biggest hole of all. The official narrative wants us to believe this is all just statistical noise, quirks of record keeping, nothing to see here, move along. But when you start pulling on this thread, the entire tapestry of accepted history starts to unravel. Because if the demographic data is this wrong, what else might we have gotten wrong? If 40 million people can disappear from history with barely a footnote, what else happened that we've forgotten or never knew about in the first place? These aren't just academic questions. They're fundamental challenges to how we understand our own past. And as we're about to see, the demographic mystery is just the beginning. The more we dig into the late 1700s, the weirder things get. Hold on to your hats, because we're just getting started, and it only gets stranger from here. Now that we've established that 40 million people mysteriously vanished from the historical record, let's talk about something that might actually explain what happened to them. And trust me, it's not going to make you feel any better about the state of the world. Between roughly 1690 and 1710, the Earth experienced what can only be described as a meteorological temper tantrum of epic proportions. We're not talking about a few bad winters or some cranky weather patterns. We're talking about a climate disaster that makes the Little Ice Age look like a mild inconvenience by comparison. The evidence comes from sources that are surprisingly reliable. Tree rings, ice cores from glaciers, and historical climate records from cultures across the globe. Tree rings are basically nature's diary. Each ring represents a year of growth, and the thickness of that ring tells us about temperature, rainfall, and growing conditions. When scientists examine tree rings from this period, they find something absolutely bizarre. Multiple years where growth virtually stopped. We're talking about rings so thin they're barely visible, which indicates growing seasons so bad that trees were basically in survival mode, putting all their energy into just not dying rather than actually growing. These aren't isolated incidents in one region. This pattern shows up in trees across Europe, Asia, and North America simultaneously. Trees in completely different climate zones, all having the same terrible experience at the same time, is about as suspicious as everyone in your class failing the same test. Either the test was impossibly hard, or something else is going on. Ice cores tell a similar story, and honestly, it's even more disturbing. When you drill into glaciers and analyze the layers of ice, you can see a record of atmospheric conditions going back thousands of years. Each layer contains tiny air bubbles, dust particles, and chemical signatures that reveal what was happening in the atmosphere when that ice formed. The layers from 1690 to 1710 are packed with volcanic ash, sulfur compounds, and other particles that indicate something was seriously wrong with the air quality. We're talking about atmospheric composition that would make modern Beijing look like a pristine mountain resort. Whatever was happening during this period wasn't just cold. It was dark, toxic, and utterly catastrophic for anything that needed sunlight to survive. Which, unfortunately for everyone living through it, includes pretty much all plants and the animals that eat those plants and the humans who eat those animals. It's a food chain disaster waiting to happen, and, spoiler alert, it happened. Historical climate records from the period paint an even grimmer picture, assuming you can find them, because there aren't many. The records that do survive describe conditions so extreme they sound like something out of an apocalyptic fantasy novel. Chinese chronicles from this era document what they called blood-colored skies. Not metaphorically blood-colored, but literally red skies that lasted for days or weeks at a time. Japanese records mention the sun that gave no warmth, which is possibly the most ominous thing you could write about the literal source of all life on Earth. European accounts, when they exist, describe rivers freezing solid in the middle of summer. Let me repeat that. Rivers. Freezing. In summer. That's not normal. That's not even abnormal. That's something has gone catastrophically wrong with the entire planet territory. Imagine planning your summer vacation and needing to pack ice skates because the Thames might be frozen over. Not exactly the beach weather you were hoping for. The agricultural impact of this climate disaster would have been absolutely devastating. Crops need specific temperature ranges and amounts of sunlight to grow. When temperatures plummet and the sky stays dark for extended periods, crops don't just grow poorly, they don't grow at all. Multiple years of crop failures in succession means famine. Widespread famine means death. Lots of death. The kind of death that could easily account for those 40 million missing people we talked about earlier. But here's the weird part. While we have climate evidence suggesting conditions were apocalyptically bad, we don't have corresponding records of mass starvation on the scale you'd expect. There should be extensive documentation of widespread famine, food riots, economic collapse, all the usual symptoms of agricultural catastrophe. Instead, we get scattered mentions of difficult years, and then nothing. It's like watching a horror movie where the monster is clearly about to attack, and then the film just cuts to everyone having brunch the next morning like nothing happened. The narrative doesn't make sense. So what could cause global climate disruption of this magnitude? The obvious candidate is volcanic activity. Massive volcanic eruptions can inject millions of tons of ash and sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere, creating what's called a volcanic winter. The particles block sunlight, temperatures drop, and the climate goes haywire for years until the atmosphere clears. We know this can happen because we've seen it in more recent history. The eruption of Mount Tambora in 1815 caused the year without a summer in 1816, leading to crop failures and food shortages across the northern hemisphere. But Tambora was a single eruption that caused one terrible year. For the climate effects we're seeing in 1690 to 1710, you'd need multiple supermassive eruptions happening close together, or one eruption so enormous it makes Tambora look like a firecracker. The problem? There's no geological evidence of volcanic activity on that scale during this period. Sure, there were some eruptions, but nothing big enough to explain 2 decades of catastrophic climate disruption. It's like finding your house completely destroyed, and then discovering that the massive earthquake that supposedly did it was actually a 2.0 on the Richter scale. The math doesn't add up. The other possibility that gets thrown around is an asteroid impact or comet airburst. If a large enough space rock hit the atmosphere or the surface, it could inject massive amounts of debris into the air, creating an impact winter similar to what supposedly killed the dinosaurs. This would explain the darkened skies, the temperature drop, and the global nature of the crisis. Small problem, though. Where's the impact crater? The Tunguska event in 1908 flattened 2,000 square kilometers of Siberian forest with an airburst estimated at 10 to 15 megatons, and we found that site easily. An impact, or airburst, big enough to darken skies globally for 2 decades should have left a scar on the landscape visible from space. Yet there's no smoking crater, no impact debris field, no geological evidence of a major impact during this period. It's possible something hit the ocean and left minimal surface evidence, but even then, we should see signatures of the impact in sediment layers. So far, nothing conclusive. Which brings us to the truly unsettling possibility. What if the climate catastrophe wasn't natural at all? What if it was the result of technology from an advanced civilization that either accidentally destroyed itself or was deliberately destroyed? Before you dismiss this as pure science fiction, consider that humanity came remarkably close to nuclear winter during the Cold War, and we're currently conducting a real-time experiment with climate change to see if we can make the planet unlivable through industrial activity alone. If a previous civilization had reached a similar or higher level of technological development, they could absolutely have caused a global climate disaster. Whether through nuclear weapons, geoengineering gone wrong, or some technology we haven't even imagined yet, advanced technology in the wrong hands, or even the right hands with bad luck, could definitely create the conditions we're seeing in the 1690 to 1710 climate data. The absence of obvious evidence doesn't mean it didn't happen. It might just mean we don't know what we're looking for. Now let's say you're civilization, and you just experienced a catastrophic climate event that killed millions of people, destroyed infrastructure, and generally made life on Earth barely survivable for 2 decades. What would you expect to happen next? Probably a long, slow recovery period, right? Generations of rebuilding, relearning lost skills, gradually clawing your way back to something resembling normalcy. That's how it's supposed to work. That's how it worked after every other major disaster in history. The fall of Rome wasn't followed by an immediate renaissance. Europe spent centuries in comparative technological stagnation before things started improving again. The Black Death didn't immediately lead to an industrial revolution. It took generations for society to recover and reorganize. But after the 1690 to 1710 climate disaster, the exact opposite happens. Between 1700 and 1750, human civilization experiences what can only be described as a technological explosion. We're talking about innovations and discoveries that fundamentally transformed how humans understood and interacted with the world, all appearing in rapid succession in a mere 50 years. This isn't normal technological development. This is humanity speedrunning the tech tree like someone activated cheat codes. The steam engine, which revolutionized transportation and industry, suddenly appears. Advanced navigational instruments that allowed precise determination of location at sea, solving a problem that had plagued sailors for millennia, just materialize. Sophisticated metallurgical techniques that enabled the production of higher quality metals and alloys come out of nowhere. Complex optical instruments like microscopes and telescopes get dramatically improved. Mathematical principles that should have required centuries of gradual development are suddenly formalized. All of this happening simultaneously across different fields and different countries. It's like watching someone play a strategy game and suddenly unlock half the tech tree at once because they found a hidden knowledge cache. What makes this technological boom even stranger is how the inventors themselves describe their discoveries. If you read accounts from scientists and inventors of this era, there's a recurring pattern. Many of them claim their breakthroughs came as sudden revelations or illuminations, rather than through methodical research and experimentation. They describe having flashes of insight, where complex concepts suddenly made sense, as if the knowledge was already there in their minds and they just needed to remember it. Even weirder, multiple inventors reference studying ancient manuscripts or lost texts that provided the foundation for their discoveries. When asked where these texts came from or who wrote them, the answers get vague and contradictory. "Oh, I found it in an old library. A monk gave it to me. It's been in my family for generations." Sure, totally believable. It's not like you're describing revolutionary technology that shouldn't exist yet based on documents whose origin is more mysterious than a fortune cookie message. The mathematical advances of this period are particularly suspicious. Complex mathematical concepts that should require extensive development time and numerous intermediate steps are formalized remarkably quickly. Calculus, for example, gets independently discovered by Isaac Newton and Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz around the same time, which is suspicious enough on its own. What are the odds that two people develop the same revolutionary mathematical system simultaneously? But it gets weirder. Both men had access to obscure mathematical texts that supposedly contained hints and precursor concepts to calculus. Where did these texts come from? Who wrote them? Why did they remain obscure until suddenly becoming relevant? It's almost as if someone scattered breadcrumbs of advanced mathematical knowledge, waiting for the right people to find them and piece together the full picture. Not that I'm suggesting anything conspiratorial, but if I wanted to subtly reintroduce lost knowledge to a civilization without being obvious about it, this is exactly how I'd do it. The precision and sophistication of new instruments developed during this period is also deeply puzzling. Creating a microscope or telescope isn't just about putting lenses together. You need precise understanding of optics, advanced glass-making techniques, and the mechanical skill to build instruments that can actually function properly. These aren't things you can just figure out through trial and error over a few years. They require extensive theoretical knowledge and practical experience. Yet somehow, in the early 1700s, craftsmen are suddenly producing optical instruments of remarkable quality without any apparent learning curve. It's like giving someone a piano and having them immediately perform Chopin without ever taking lessons. Either these people were all secret geniuses who independently discovered advanced optical principles simultaneously, or they had access to knowledge that shouldn't have been available. One of these explanations makes sense. The other suggests something much more interesting happened. The pattern that emerges from all this is clear. After a devastating climate catastrophe that should have set human civilization back by centuries, technology instead advances by leaps and bounds. Knowledge that should take generations to develop appears suddenly, often attributed to mysterious sources that can't be verified. It's as if someone hit the reset button on civilization in 1700 and then immediately started uploading the tech tree, perhaps from backed-up files of a previous civilization. Whether this was intentional, survivors of an advanced culture deliberately guiding humanity's recovery, or accidental, people finding and learning from remnants of lost knowledge, is impossible to say based on the evidence we have. But what is clear is that something deeply strange happened in the transition from the 17th to the 18th century, and the official historical narrative completely fails to account for it. Climate disasters don't usually lead to technological renaissances. Population crashes don't typically precede knowledge explosions. None of this makes sense unless something else was going on, something that isn't in our history books. And as we'll see, this is just the beginning of the anomalies that cluster around the year 1700. If demographic mysteries and climate catastrophes weren't enough to make you question everything you thought you knew about the 1700s, let's add another layer of absolute weirdness: the maps. Specifically, maps created before 1700 that show things they absolutely should not be able to show, with a level of accuracy that shouldn't be possible given the technology supposedly available at the time. We're talking about cartographic achievements that make modern surveyors go, "Wait, how did they do that?" Followed by nervous laughter and existential dread about the nature of historical reality. Let's start with the celebrity of impossible maps, the Piri Reis map of 1513. This thing is a legitimate historical artifact. It's not some conspiracy theorist's Photoshop project. It's sitting in a museum in Istanbul where you can go look at it yourself. The map was created by Ottoman admiral and cartographer Piri Reis, who was, by all accounts, a skilled navigator and mapmaker. Nothing unusual there. But the map itself? Deeply, profoundly unusual. The Piri Reis map shows the Atlantic Ocean coastlines of South America and Africa with remarkable accuracy for the early 16th century. Impressive, but not impossible. Portuguese and Spanish explorers had been sailing those waters and creating maps based on their observations. What's impossible is what the map shows at the bottom, a detailed coastline of Antarctica. Not Antarctica covered in ice like it is today and has been for millions of years, but Antarctica's actual rocky coastline, the one that's currently hidden under kilometers of ice. Now you might be thinking, okay, maybe they just guessed what was under there, or maybe it's not actually Antarctica. Except it is. When modern researchers compared the Piri Reis map to seismic data of Antarctica's subglacial topography, the correlation was disturbingly accurate. The bays, the mountain ranges, the geographical features, they match. This is not a lucky guess. This is detailed geographic knowledge of a continent that wouldn't be officially discovered until 1820, and whose ice-free coastline hasn't been visible in recorded human history. The last time Antarctica was ice-free enough to map its coastline was potentially millions of years ago, certainly long before humans supposedly developed the technology to create accurate maps. So either Piri Reis had access to some incredibly advanced ancient sources, or someone was doing aerial surveillance of Antarctica before the Ice Age and casually left their maps lying around for a 16th century Ottoman admiral to find. Both options are deeply concerning. Piri Reis himself claimed he compiled his map from older source maps, some dating back to the time of Alexander the Great and earlier. Which raises the obvious question: who was making accurate maps of Antarctica thousands of years ago? And how? You can't accurately map a continent from sea level. You need elevation. You need a bird's eye view. You need technology that lets you see the big picture. Ancient civilizations supposedly didn't have aircraft, satellites, or any method of achieving the aerial perspective necessary for this level of cartographic accuracy. Unless they did, and we've somehow managed to lose all evidence of it, except for these maps that keep showing up like historical Easter eggs waiting to blow minds. The Piri Reis map isn't alone in its impossible accuracy. There's a whole collection of pre-1700 maps that demonstrate surveying precision that shouldn't exist. Maps showing longitude calculations that were supposedly impossible until the invention of the marine chronometer in the mid-18th century. Maps depicting geographical features with accuracy comparable to satellite imaging. Maps showing cities and settlements in locations where modern archaeology finds only ruins or nothing at all. It's like someone had access to Google Earth several centuries before Google Earth existed, printed out some maps, and then dropped them into history to confuse future researchers. Mission accomplished, mysterious ancient cartographers. We're very confused. What makes this even stranger is the pattern of cartographic accuracy over time. Maps from the 16th and early 17th centuries often show this impossible precision. Then, right around 1700, that cursed year again, map accuracy suddenly plummets. Maps from the early 18th century are noticeably less accurate than maps from 150 years earlier, which is the opposite of how technological progress is supposed to work. It's like watching someone forget how to use GPS and going back to asking for directions at gas stations. Over the following 150 years, map accuracy gradually improves as surveying techniques advance and better instruments are developed, eventually reaching and then surpassing the accuracy of those mysterious pre-1700 maps. But the gap is there, clear as day in the historical record. Something was lost after 1700. Something that gave earlier cartographers capabilities that shouldn't have existed, and it took a century and a half to rediscover it through conventional technological development. The geographical inconsistencies on these old maps are equally bizarre. Many pre-1700 maps show large cities in locations that are today just ruins, empty fields, or completely barren. We're not talking about minor villages that got abandoned. We're talking about major population centers depicted with the kind of detail and prominence you'd expect for significant urban areas. Then you flip to a modern map and there's nothing there. Did these cities exist and then get completely erased from history? Were they destroyed so thoroughly that barely any trace remains? Or were the mapmakers just really optimistic about urban development in those areas and drew in cities that never actually existed? None of these explanations are particularly satisfying. Conversely, Some modern major cities are completely absent from these old maps, even though the surrounding geography is depicted accurately. It's as if the mapmakers were working from an earlier version of Earth's geography, one where the distribution of human settlements was fundamentally different from what we see today. Now let's talk about what's literally underneath our feet in major European cities, because this is where things go from weird maps to, okay, reality is definitely not what we've been told. Archaeological and construction excavations in cities across Europe have revealed a pattern so consistent and so strange that it really should be getting more attention than it does. Major cities that were supposedly founded in the 17th or 18th centuries, according to official histories, are built on top of massive megalithic foundations that go down dozens of meters into the ground. These aren't ordinary foundations. These are engineering marvels constructed from perfectly fitted stone blocks weighing up to 200 tons each, joined together without mortar with such precision that you can't fit a sheet of paper between them. The kind of construction that makes modern engineers scratch their heads and mutter about how they're not entirely sure how it was done even with current technology. The technological sophistication of these foundations is honestly terrifying when you think about it. Moving 200-ton stone blocks requires serious engineering capability. Cutting them with micrometer precision requires advanced tools and measuring equipment. Fitting them together without mortar while maintaining structural integrity requires mathematical and architectural knowledge that supposedly didn't exist when these foundations were built. According to official history, these are Roman foundations or medieval basements. But Roman and medieval construction, while impressive, didn't operate at this level of precision and scale. The Romans used mortar. Medieval builders used mortar. Everyone used mortar because fitting massive stone blocks together perfectly without any binding agent is incredibly difficult and not particularly practical. Unless you have technology and methods that make it easier than using mortar, in which case, what technology were they using? What makes this even more surreal is what's built on top of these advanced foundations. Ordinary 18th and 19th century buildings made from brick and timber. Not particularly sophisticated brick and timber either. Just standard construction of the era, the kind of buildings you'd expect from people who were doing their best with available resources and technology. The contrast is jarring. It's like finding a modern apartment complex built on top of a fusion reactor. The technological gap between the foundation and the structure above it is so vast that it creates cognitive dissonance. You're looking at evidence of two completely different levels of civilization occupying the same space, separated by layers of sediment and centuries of time. The lower layer demonstrates advanced engineering that rivals or exceeds modern capabilities. The upper layer is what you'd expect from a pre-industrial society. And somehow, we're supposed to believe this makes perfect sense and definitely doesn't indicate anything unusual happened. Official historical explanations for these megalithic foundations are, to put it charitably, unconvincing. Oh, those are Roman ruins. Really? Show me the Roman text describing the construction methods for fitting 200-ton blocks together with micrometer precision. They're medieval basements. Sure, because medieval builders definitely had the capability to move blocks that size and fit them perfectly, without modern machinery or measuring tools. That's definitely a thing that happened regularly in medieval Europe, which is why we see this level of precision in all medieval construction, and not just mysteriously in the foundations of major cities. Wait, we don't? Interesting. The explanations don't hold up to even basic scrutiny. They're essentially saying, don't think too hard about it, and hoping nobody asks inconvenient questions about tonnage and precision engineering. The pattern repeats across Europe in city after city. St. Petersburg, supposedly founded in 1703, sits on foundations that demonstrate construction capabilities far beyond what early 18th century Russia should have possessed. Major cities in France, Germany, Italy, all showing the same strange pattern of advanced megalithic foundations with relatively primitive buildings on top. It's not isolated incidents that could be explained away as anomalies. It's a consistent architectural pattern across an entire continent, which suggests either a widespread civilization with advanced construction capabilities that predated the official founding dates of these cities, or a complete rewriting of history that obscured when and how these cities were actually built. Neither option aligns with what we're taught in school. The sediment layers between the megalithic foundations and the later buildings tell their own story. In many excavations, there are meters of compressed sediment, a mixture of mud, debris, and organic material that appears to have been deposited rapidly and then compacted under pressure. This isn't gradual accumulation over centuries. This is sudden deposition of material on a massive scale, consistent with flooding or some other catastrophic event that buried existing structures under layers of muck. The buildings from the 18th and 19th centuries are literally built on top of this sediment layer, as if the earlier city was buried and then a new city was constructed on the resulting elevated ground level. If this happened on a small scale, you'd call it a local flood. When it's happening across an entire continent, with the sediment layer dating to roughly the same period, late 17th to early 18th century, you're looking at something much larger and more terrifying. A global flood, perhaps. Or at least a series of catastrophic flooding events that buried the old world and forced survivors to rebuild on top of the mud. Here's what really gets me about all this. The first floors of many old buildings in European cities are below current ground level. Not slightly below, meters below. You go into basements that have windows designed for ground floor rooms, staircases that lead down to what were clearly main entrances, architectural features that only make sense if you're looking at the original ground level of a building that has since been partially buried. The official explanation is, oh, the ground level rose over time through natural accumulation of debris and construction. Which, sure, ground levels in cities do rise gradually over centuries, but we're talking about multi-meter increases in ground level happening in a relatively short period, which natural accumulation can't explain. It's more consistent with the city being partially buried by some kind of sediment deposition event, and then having new streets and buildings constructed on top of the new elevated surface. Like someone hit pause on civilization, dumped several meters of mud everywhere, and then hit play again, with everyone just accepting that their first floors were now basements. The maps and the architecture tell the same story from different angles. The maps suggest that pre-1700 civilization had access to knowledge and technology that enabled impossibly accurate surveying of the entire planet, including regions that shouldn't have been mapped yet. The architecture shows that major cities were built on foundations demonstrating engineering capabilities that far exceed what official history attributes to the periods when these foundations were supposedly constructed. Both the maps and the buildings suggest a more advanced civilization existing before 1700, followed by a catastrophic event that buried or destroyed that civilization, after which a less advanced society rebuilt on the ruins. The demographic collapse, the climate disaster, the buried cities, the impossible maps, they all point to the same conclusion. Something world-changing happened around 1700, something that reset human civilization and forced survivors to start over. And for some reason, this event has been scrubbed from the historical record so thoroughly that most people don't even know to ask questions about it. But the evidence is still there, literally under our feet and in museum collections, waiting for anyone who cares to look closely enough to notice that nothing about the official story makes sense. Here's something that should bother you more than it probably does. Humanity forgot how to do things. Not complicated, cutting-edge things that require specialized knowledge maintained by a small group of experts. We're talking about basic technologies and crafts that had been practiced continuously for centuries, sometimes millennia, by communities of artisans passing their skills down through generations. And then, right around 1700, because of course it's 1700 again, all of this knowledge just vanishes. Not gradually, not in isolated incidents, but systematically across multiple disciplines and regions. It's like someone performed a hard reset on civilization's collective memory. And when the system rebooted, half the software didn't reinstall properly. Let's start with one of history's most impressive "oops, we forgot" moments. Roman concrete. The Romans were absolutely obsessed with concrete, and honestly, they had every right to be. Their concrete was genuinely superior to most modern concrete in specific applications, particularly underwater construction. Roman concrete structures built in seawater have survived for over 2,000 years and are still standing strong today, while modern concrete structures in similar conditions often start deteriorating within decades. The Romans built harbors, aqueducts, buildings, and infrastructure using this remarkable material. The recipe was widely known and extensively used throughout the Roman Empire, which, at its peak, controlled most of Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. Thousands of builders knew how to make it. It was a fundamental technology of their civilization, like how we use steel and reinforced concrete today. And then we forgot how to make it. Not immediately after Rome fell. That would at least make some sense given the collapse of centralized authority and trade networks. The knowledge persisted in various forms throughout the medieval period, but by the 18th century, The specific formula for creating concrete that could set underwater and last thousands of years was completely lost. Modern scientists have only recently figured out the chemical composition through extensive analysis of surviving Roman structures, and even now, replicating the exact process remains challenging. So we went from thousands of builders routinely making this stuff to literally nobody knows how to do it anymore to we need advanced scientific equipment to reverse engineer it. That's not natural knowledge loss. That's a catastrophic break in the transmission of information that should have been impossible given how widespread the technology was. It's like if everyone on Earth suddenly forgot how to make aspirin, and scientists in the year 2300 had to use mass spectrometry to figure out what mysterious substance ancient people were using to cure headaches. Damascus steel is another spectacular example of we definitely knew how to do this, and then we definitely didn't. Damascus steel blades, produced primarily in the Middle East, were legendary for their strength, flexibility, and distinctive watery pattern on the surface. These weren't luxury novelty items. They were practical weapons and tools that demonstrated superior material properties compared to European steel of the same period. The production technique was well established and had been refined over centuries. Multiple workshops across the region produced these blades using knowledge passed down through generations of smiths. Then, sometime around the 18th century, the technique was lost. Completely lost. Modern metallurgists have spent decades trying to recreate authentic Damascus steel, and while we've gotten close, there's still debate about whether we've truly replicated the original process or just achieved similar results through different methods. The timeline here is suspicious. Damascus steel production declines noticeably in the 18th century and is essentially gone by the 19th. This coincides perfectly with our mystery period around 1700. Now, the official explanation is that the ore sources changed, or trade routes were disrupted, or demand decreased. But these explanations don't hold up well under scrutiny. If a technology is valuable, and the knowledge is held by multiple independent craftsmen, losing it entirely requires either killing all the craftsmen simultaneously or destroying all the written and oral records of the technique. Neither of these things supposedly happened, yet the knowledge vanished anyway. It's like if everyone who knew how to make smartphones suddenly disappeared, along with all documentation about smartphones, and people in the future had to invent them again from scratch. Actually, that's a terrifying thought experiment, so let's move on. Medieval stained glass presents another fascinating case of convenient amnesia. The stunning stained glass windows of Gothic cathedrals, particularly those created in the 12th and 13th centuries, used colors and techniques that later craftsmen couldn't reproduce. The deep, luminous blues and reds in windows like those at Chartres Cathedral were created using methods that were somehow lost by the Renaissance period. When later generations tried to repair or replicate these windows, they couldn't match the colors. They had access to the actual windows as reference. They had glass-making traditions stretching back centuries, and yet they couldn't figure out how their predecessors achieved those specific hues and that particular quality of light transmission. It took modern chemical analysis to begin understanding the composition of medieval glass, and even now, perfectly replicating it is difficult. So we're supposed to believe that craftsmen who spent their entire lives making stained glass somehow failed to pass this knowledge to the next generation, despite it being their literal job to train apprentices. Sure, that makes perfect sense. Nothing suspicious about that at all. The list of forgotten technologies goes on and on. Certain dyes that produced colors of remarkable vibrancy and durability were lost, requiring later chemists to develop synthetic alternatives. Specific medicinal preparations that were standard in medieval and Renaissance pharmacology became mysteries that needed to be rediscovered through modern pharmaceutical research. Building techniques that allowed the construction of massive stone structures without the aid of modern machinery were forgotten, forcing later architects to develop new methods, often less elegant and more resource-intensive, to achieve similar results. In field after field, craft after craft, there's this pattern of sophisticated knowledge existing, being widely practiced, and then mysteriously disappearing right around the 18th century. It's not the gradual evolution of technology where old methods are replaced by better ones. It's wholesale loss of functional knowledge that later had to be painstakingly recovered or reinvented. What makes this mass forgetting particularly strange is that it contradicts how knowledge transmission normally works. Craftsmen and artisans don't just keep secrets in their heads. They train apprentices, they write things down, they pass knowledge through guild systems, master-student relationships, family traditions. There's redundancy built into the system specifically to prevent knowledge loss. For multiple technologies to be simultaneously lost across different regions and disciplines, you'd need to disrupt all of these transmission mechanisms at once. That requires either a catastrophic event that killed or displaced most of the skilled craftsmen while also destroying their records, or deliberate suppression of knowledge on a massive scale. Neither option is comforting, but both are more plausible than everyone just forgot, as if civilization collectively got amnesia from hitting its head. Now you might think things can't get weirder than an entire civilization forgetting how to do things it had been doing for centuries. But hold my beer, because we need to talk about what happened with calendars. Between 1699 and 1752, more than 30 countries and regions around the world underwent calendar reforms. Not minor adjustments, major overhauls of how they counted years and organized time. Russia switched from the Byzantine calendar to the Julian calendar in 1700, effectively jumping forward 5,508 years in their chronology. England and its colonies adopted the Gregorian calendar in 1752, dropping 11 days from the calendar in September. But it wasn't just European countries. Nations in Asia, the Middle East, and even isolated regions in the Americas reformed their calendars during this same relatively narrow time window. All of them, in one way or another, were establishing new starting points for counting years, as if someone declared, "Okay, we're resetting the clock now, everyone get on board." Let's think about what it takes to coordinate something like this in the early 18th century. There's no internet, no telegraph, no telephone, no radio. Communication between continents takes months. A letter from Europe to China might take half a year to arrive, assuming the ship doesn't sink. Most of the global population is illiterate. News travels slowly, often by word of mouth, getting garbled in translation. The idea that 30-plus different political entities, many of which had minimal contact with each other, would simultaneously decide to reform their calendars in similar ways is absurd. It would be like every country on Earth suddenly deciding to switch to metric time without any international communication or coordination. Actually, we tried to get the world on a single temperature measurement system, and we still can't get America to use Celsius. But apparently, in the 1700s, with no modern communication infrastructure, dozens of countries all decided now is the time to change our calendars, within a few decades of each other. Right. The official explanation for these calendar reforms is that they were necessary to align with astronomical reality and fix errors that had accumulated in various calendar systems. Which is technically true, but doesn't explain the timing or the synchronicity. Calendar errors don't suddenly become unbearable simultaneously across multiple cultures. These errors had existed for centuries. The Julian calendar's drift from solar years was known since at least the 16th century. Yet the major wave of reforms happens in the late 17th and 18th centuries. Why then? Why all at once? If different societies were independently deciding to fix their calendars based purely on astronomical observations, you'd expect these reforms to be spread out over a much longer period, happening whenever individual cultures got around to it. Instead, they cluster tightly around our favorite cursed time period, the turn of the 18th century. What's even more interesting is what these calendar reforms have in common. They're not just technical adjustments to align with the solar year. They're resetting the historical timeline. When Russia jumped forward over 5,000 years in its calendar, it wasn't just changing when New Year's Day fell. It was fundamentally altering its relationship to recorded history. Years that were counted as being thousands of years in the past suddenly became mere hundreds of years ago. Historical events got chronologically compressed, and the ancient past got less ancient. Similar compressions happened with other calendar reforms, though not always as dramatically. The overall effect across all these reforms was to shorten recorded history, to make the past less distant, to establish new starting points that made pre-reform chronology harder to reference and easier to forget. If you wanted to cover up a major historical event or reset civilization's understanding of its own past, calendar reform would be an excellent way to do it. Change how people count years. Introduce confusion about historical dates. Make it difficult to correlate events from before and after the reform. Within a few generations, people lose track of the old chronology and accept the new one as natural and obvious. That happened in year 7208 of the Byzantine calendar, becomes meaningless when everyone's now counting in Anno Domini. Records that used the old dating system become difficult to interpret. Historical continuity gets broken, and with it, the collective memory of what really happened before the reset. The synchronicity of these reforms suggests either unprecedented global coordination or a universal trigger that made calendar reform urgently necessary everywhere at once. Global coordination in the early 18th century seems impossible unless there was some kind of international authority or network capable of communicating and enforcing this change, which officially didn't exist. A universal trigger is more plausible, but raises the question: what event would make dozens of different cultures simultaneously decide their calendars were wrong and needed to be replaced? A global catastrophe that disrupted the normal passage of seasons would certainly do it. If winter and summer stopped arriving on schedule because of a climate disaster, the old calendars would become useless, and new ones, based on the new reality, would be necessary. Which brings us right back to that climate anomaly we discussed earlier. Here's the pattern we keep seeing. Around 1700, there's a demographic collapse, a climate catastrophe, impossible maps becoming less accurate, advanced foundations getting buried and built over, widespread forgetting of established technologies, and synchronized calendar reforms across the globe. These aren't isolated quirks of history. They're all symptoms of something big, something that fundamentally disrupted human civilization at a global scale. The forgetting of technologies suggests a massive loss of skilled craftsmen and disruption of knowledge transmission. The calendar reforms suggest either coordinated action by a global authority that shouldn't exist, or a shared catastrophe that made old timekeeping systems obsolete. Either way, it points to the same conclusion. The official story of the 18th century is missing a rather large chapter, and that chapter probably involves something terrifying that survivors decided it was better to forget about entirely. The cultural amnesia and calendar synchronization are two more pieces of evidence that don't fit the narrative of steady, predictable historical progression. Knowledge doesn't just disappear from multiple fields simultaneously through natural causes. 30 countries don't reform their calendars in the same 50-year period by coincidence. These are planned actions or reactions to extraordinary circumstances, and the fact that mainstream history treats them as unconnected random events rather than symptoms of a larger pattern is itself suspicious. Either historians have somehow missed one of the most significant events in human history, or they've noticed it and decided, for reasons unknown, that it's better left unexamined. And honestly, I'm not sure which possibility is more disturbing. But we're not done yet. The evidence keeps piling up, and it only gets stranger from here. If you thought we were done discovering weird things about the 1700s, surprise, we're just getting warmed up. Because now we need to talk about something that's literally beneath our feet in cities across the world. A mysterious layer of compressed sediment that shouldn't exist but definitely does. Archaeologists and construction crews keep finding it during excavations, and every time they do, they're confronted with physical evidence of something catastrophic that happened around 1700. We're not talking about theories or historical speculation anymore. This is actual, measurable, datable geological evidence that something went profoundly wrong with the planet in the late 17th century. And the best part? Most people have no idea this evidence exists, because it's not exactly front-page news when archaeologists find yet another inconvenient layer of mud that doesn't fit the official historical narrative. Here's what excavations keep revealing. There's a sediment layer found in cities across Europe, Asia, and even parts of the Americas that dates consistently to the period between 1680 and 1720. This isn't normal urban accumulation where dirt and debris gradually build up over centuries. This is a distinct, compressed layer of sediment that contains a bizarre mixture of materials that shouldn't be together. We're talking about marine silt, the kind of material you find on the ocean floor, mixed with river deposits, urban debris, organic matter, and various other materials all compressed together with significant force. It's like someone took the ocean, several rivers, and a city, threw them all in a blender, poured the mixture everywhere, and then used a hydraulic press to compact it. The composition alone suggests catastrophic flooding on a scale that makes your typical river overflow look like a spilled glass of water. Radiocarbon dating of organic material from this sediment layer consistently places it in the late 17th to early 18th century. Now, radiocarbon dating isn't perfect. It has margins of error. But when you're getting consistent dates from samples taken from different cities in different countries, that's not a coincidence. That's a pattern. That's evidence of a simultaneous event affecting multiple locations at the same time. And before you ask, yes, researchers have considered whether this could be multiple unrelated local floods happening independently. The answer is no, because the sediment composition, the compression, and the dating all match too closely. You don't get identical geological signatures from independent events unless there's a common cause. It's like if everyone in your neighborhood got sick at the same time, with the exact same symptoms. You wouldn't conclude that they all coincidentally caught different diseases. You'd conclude there was a contaminated water source or someone brought a nasty virus to the block party. What's underneath this mud layer is even more fascinating and disturbing. When archaeologists dig through the sediment, they find remains of sophisticated infrastructure, paved streets with proper drainage systems, water pipes made from advanced materials, buildings with architectural features indicating significant engineering knowledge. These aren't primitive structures. These are the remains of developed urban environments with public works and civil planning. The buildings have proper foundations, evidence of multi-story construction, and details that indicate comfort and aesthetic consideration beyond mere survival. In other words, this was a functioning civilization with technology and organizational capacity. And then it got buried. Completely buried under meters of compressed sediment in what must have been a relatively short period because there's no evidence of gradual accumulation or people attempting to clear the mud as it built up. It happened fast enough that the infrastructure was simply overwhelmed and abandoned. The buildings from this buried layer often have their first floors, and sometimes second floors, completely underground from the current street level. You can find windows that were clearly designed to be at ground level now sitting several meters below the surface. Doorways that opened onto streets now open onto solid earth. Staircases that led up to main entrances now lead down into what modern people call basements, but which were originally ground floor rooms. The architecture makes no sense unless you understand that the ground level has risen dramatically since these buildings were constructed. And the only explanation for such a rapid rise in ground level is massive sediment deposition from flooding. You can't gradually adjust to your first floor becoming a basement. That's not how urban planning works. What happened was catastrophic. Water came, brought all this sediment with it, buried existing structures, and when the water receded, people were left with a new elevated surface to build on. Imagine waking up one day and your entire city is several meters deep in mud. That's not a minor inconvenience. That's a civilization-ending disaster. Now, above this mud layer, we find a completely different type of construction. The buildings from the 18th and 19th centuries that sit on top of the sediment are noticeably more primitive than what's underneath. We're talking about simple brick and timber construction. Nothing fancy. Nothing that demonstrates the engineering sophistication of the buried structures below. It's like comparing a modern apartment complex to a log cabin. Both are functional shelters, but they represent vastly different levels of technological capability and resources. The contrast is so stark that it's genuinely baffling from a historical perspective. How do you go from advanced urban infrastructure to basic construction unless there's been a catastrophic loss of knowledge, skills, and resources? The official explanation would have us believe this is just the normal progression of architectural styles, or that the lower structures are much older than they appear. But the dating doesn't support that, and the technological regression doesn't make sense unless something intervened to reset civilization's capabilities. The global distribution of this sediment layer is what really seals the deal. This isn't a regional flood that affected one river valley or one coastal area. This pattern shows up in cities across multiple continents. European cities have it. Russian cities have it. Excavations in parts of Asia reveal similar layers. Even some locations in the Americas show evidence of this period of catastrophic sediment deposition. For this to happen simultaneously across such a wide geographic area, you need a truly global event. Local flooding happens all the time and leaves evidence, but it's localized. You don't get identical geological signatures thousands of miles apart from independent local floods. This required something big enough to affect sea levels, weather patterns, and water distribution across the entire planet. Whether that was climate-induced catastrophic flooding from rapid ice melt, tectonic activity triggering tsunamis, or something even more exotic, the evidence suggests water and sediment moved on a scale that would make the biblical flood look modest by comparison. The implications of this geological evidence are staggering. If there was flooding severe enough to bury cities under meters of sediment across multiple continents, the human death toll would have been enormous. This could easily account for those 40 million missing people we discussed earlier. Flood disasters are efficient killers. They destroy infrastructure, contaminate water supplies, eliminate food sources, and spread disease. A global flood event would be an extinction-level threat to human civilization. The fact that humanity survived at all suggests either remarkable resilience, advance warning that allowed some preparation, or possibly intervention by someone with the resources to preserve a remnant population. Which brings us to the uncomfortable question. If flooding on this scale happened, and if it killed millions of people, why isn't this the central event in early 18th century history? Why isn't every history book leading with, and then the world flooded and nearly everyone died? The absence of this event from mainstream historical narratives, despite physical evidence of its occurrence, is arguably more disturbing than the event itself. Now, while we're contemplating catastrophic global floods and buried civilizations, let's add another layer of weirdness that makes the whole situation even more suspicious. Starting in the 1720s, conveniently right after our mystery flood and climate disaster, something extraordinary happens with education systems around the world. Suddenly, across Europe, Russia, the Americas, and even parts of Asia, standardized education systems appear with remarkable similarity. We're not talking about the gradual spread of educational ideas through cultural exchange and slow adoption. We're talking about synchronized implementation of nearly identical curricula, textbooks, and teaching methodologies across regions that had minimal contact with each other. It's like someone hit the Deploy Education System Globally button, and it just happened everywhere at once. In the 1720s. Without internet, without international organizations, without any mechanism that should have made this possible. The textbooks from this period are particularly suspicious. When researchers examine surviving educational materials from different countries in the 1720s to 1750s period, they find startling similarities. Arithmetic textbooks from France, Germany, Russia, and England use the same examples, the same problem-solving methods, even the same illustrations in many cases. Grammar books across different languages follow identical structural approaches to teaching. Geography texts present the same worldview with similar maps and descriptions. History textbooks, and this is where it gets really interesting, tell remarkably similar stories about human history, emphasizing the same events and downplaying or ignoring the same periods. It's like someone created a master curriculum and then distributed translated versions to every country, ensuring that everyone learned the same things in the same way. Which would be a neat trick to pull off in an era when copying a book meant writing it out by hand or using early printing presses that were slow, expensive, and limited in distribution. Who coordinated this global educational standardization? That's the question nobody has a good answer for. There was no UNESCO in 1720. There was no International Education Committee deciding on curriculum standards. Most countries were still primarily concerned with their own regional affairs, and the concept of global cooperation on social programs was centuries away from being a realistic possibility. Communication between continents took months. Different regions had different languages, different cultural priorities, different educational philosophies. The idea that they would all independently develop nearly identical education systems at the same time is statistically impossible. The idea that they coordinated this development together raises even more questions. Who had the authority to coordinate? Who had the resources to produce and distribute these materials? Who had the motivation to ensure that children across the entire world were being taught the same things? What makes this educational synchronization even more suspicious is what these textbooks actually teach about history. When you examine the historical content in these standardized texts, there's a noticeable pattern. History basically starts around 1700. Events before that date are described vaguely, inconsistently, and often contradictorily between sources. Ancient civilizations get brief mentions with little detail. Medieval history is compressed and simplified. The time periods that should be richest in documented events, the immediately preceding centuries, are curiously thin on specifics. Then, starting around 1700, the historical narrative suddenly becomes detailed and confident. It's like someone decided that everything before 1700 was ancient history that didn't need to be examined too closely, while everything after was important modern history that students needed to understand in detail. If you wanted to obscure or minimize a major historical event, making sure the next generation's textbooks glossed over the relevant time period would be an excellent strategy. The illustrations and examples in these textbooks are also standardized in ways that shouldn't be possible. Before mass media, cultural imagery was highly localized. Different regions had different artistic styles, different visual conventions, different ways of representing concepts. Yet these textbooks from different countries show remarkable consistency in their illustrations. Maps look similar. Scientific diagrams use the same conventions. Historical figures are depicted in comparable ways. This level of visual standardization requires either a common source that everyone copied from, or centralized production and distribution that ensured uniformity. Both options imply a level of organization and coordination that official history says didn't exist in the 1720s. It's like finding that fast food restaurants in the 1720s all had the same menu and logos. It suggests corporate standardization that shouldn't have been possible in that era. The timing of this educational reset is, of course, perfectly aligned with everything else we've been discussing. After the demographic collapse, the climate disaster, the calendar reforms, the forgetting of technologies, and the geological evidence of catastrophic flooding, suddenly there's a coordinated effort to educate the surviving or rebuilt population, using standardized materials that carefully frame what they're taught about history. If you were trying to rebuild civilization after a catastrophic reset, establishing a controlled narrative through education would be a logical step. Make sure the new generation learns what you want them to know about the past, present it in a way that seems authoritative and complete, and avoid dwelling on uncomfortable questions about what happened before the reset. Within a few generations, the standardized narrative becomes accepted truth, and alternative understandings of history fade from collective memory. The language used in these textbooks is also telling. They present historical information with absolute confidence, even when describing events from periods that supposedly have limited documentation. There's no hedging, no acknowledgement of uncertainty, no suggestion that there might be gaps in our knowledge of the past. This is how history happened, these books declare, and students should memorize it accordingly. That level of confidence is suspicious when combined with the vagueness about pre-1700 events. It's like someone saying, I definitely remember everything that happened last week in perfect detail, but everything before last month is kind of fuzzy and not that important anyway. The rhetorical strategy is to establish authority for the recent past, while minimizing questions about the distant past, which conveniently includes the period of our catastrophic reset. What's fascinating is that this standardized education system succeeded. By the late 18th century, educated people across Europe, Russia, and increasingly in the Americas and Asia shared a common understanding of history, science, and the world. They'd been taught from similar books, learned similar facts, internalized similar frameworks for understanding reality. This uniformity of thought would have been impossible without the synchronized educational implementation of the 1720s to 1750s. Whether this was an intentional conspiracy to control knowledge or a practical response to rebuilding civilization after a disaster, the effect was the same: the establishment of a standardized narrative that became the foundation for modern historical understanding. And that narrative conveniently skips over or minimizes the very events we're investigating: the population collapse, the climate catastrophe, the flooding, the technological reset. The geological evidence of flooding and the synchronization of education systems are two more pieces of the puzzle that don't fit the official story. Sediment layers don't lie. They're physical evidence of water and debris deposited with enough force to bury cities. The dating places this event exactly where all our other evidence points to, around 1700. The educational standardization that follows is too coordinated, too uniform, and too conveniently timed to be coincidental. Together, they paint a picture of a world that experienced catastrophic flooding, lost much of its population and infrastructure, and then underwent a controlled rebuilding process that included carefully managing what future generations would be taught about what happened. Whether this was done by a surviving elite, an external authority, or some other organizing force, the evidence suggests it was intentional. And that raises the ultimate question: if something this significant happened, why don't we know about it? Who decided that this chapter of human history should be erased or obscured? And what else about our past has been carefully edited to prevent us from understanding what really happened? Just when you thought this story couldn't get any stranger, we need to talk about babies. Specifically, we need to talk about where all the babies came from after the population collapse we discussed earlier. Remember those 40 million missing people? Remember how the population mysteriously rebounded in the 1720s despite the demographic math making absolutely no sense? Well, there's an explanation for that rapid recovery, and it's possibly the most unsettling part of this entire investigation. Because starting in the late 17th century and exploding in the early 18th century, massive institutions dedicated to raising enormous numbers of infants appeared across Europe and Russia. We're not talking about small orphanages or modest charitable homes. We're talking about industrial-scale facilities capable of housing and raising tens of thousands of babies simultaneously. And they appeared suddenly, fully formed, with technological sophistication that shouldn't have existed in that era. If you wanted to rapidly repopulate a civilization after a catastrophic die-off, This is exactly how you do it. The historical record for these institutions is extensive and deeply weird once you start paying attention to the details. They went by various names in different regions: foundling hospitals, foundling homes, orphanages, charitable institutions. But regardless of the name, their function was the same. They took in huge numbers of infants, often abandoned at birth, sometimes under mysterious circumstances, and raised them using systematic methods that sound more like factory production than childcare. The scale alone is staggering. The Ospedale degli Innocenti in Florence, established in the early 15th century, greatly expanded its operations in the early 18th century, and at its peak was processing thousands of infants annually. The Foundling Hospital in London, established in 1739, was accepting over 1,000 babies per year within a few decades of opening. In Russia, massive foundling homes appeared in Moscow and St. Petersburg in the mid-18th century, each capable of housing over 20,000 children at once. To put that in perspective, that's a small city's worth of children being raised in a single institution. That's not an orphanage. That's a human production facility. What makes these institutions particularly suspicious is how suddenly they appeared and how well equipped they were right from the start. Building facilities capable of housing thousands of infants isn't trivial. You need advanced heating systems because babies are terrible at temperature regulation and die easily from cold. You need sophisticated ventilation because crowded spaces with inadequate airflow become disease incubators. And if you're trying to raise thousands of babies in one place, an outbreak means losing your entire crop. You need systematic feeding methods because you can't just have staff randomly feeding babies whenever they feel like it. You need schedules, processes, equipment. These foundling homes had all of this. They had heating systems that distributed warmth evenly throughout large buildings, which is non-trivial engineering in an era that mostly relied on fireplaces and stoves. They had ventilation systems that managed air quality in crowded dormitories. They had feeding equipment and protocols that allowed relatively small staff to care for enormous numbers of infants. This is industrial-age infrastructure and methodology, appearing in what's supposed to be the pre-industrial era. It's like finding a fully operational modern hospital in the 1700s, complete with HVAC systems and feeding protocols that wouldn't look out of place in a contemporary neonatal ward. The feeding systems deserve special attention because they're genuinely bizarre. These institutions developed mechanical devices for feeding multiple infants simultaneously, with minimal human intervention. We're talking about contraptions that could deliver measured amounts of milk or formula to dozens of babies at once, operated by a single caretaker. The official explanation is that these were simple mechanical innovations driven by necessity. When you have thousands of mouths to feed, you get creative. But the level of sophistication suggests more than improvisation. These weren't crude devices cobbled together by desperate staff. These were carefully designed systems that required knowledge of nutrition, fluid dynamics, and manufacturing precision. Someone had to understand infant nutritional needs well enough to develop appropriate feeding solutions. Someone had to engineer delivery mechanisms that worked reliably without harming the babies. Someone had to manufacture these devices at scale and distribute them to institutions across different countries. That level of coordinated technological development doesn't happen spontaneously in isolated charitable organizations. That requires planning, resources, and knowledge that shouldn't have been available. The architecture of these buildings is also telling. When you look at surviving foundling hospitals from this period, they're not repurposed existing structures or hastily constructed warehouses. They're purpose-built facilities designed specifically for mass child-rearing. The layout is optimized for efficiency. Dormitories arranged to maximize supervision, kitchens positioned for efficient food distribution, bathing facilities designed for processing large numbers of children, educational spaces integrated into the design. This is institutional architecture of a type that shouldn't really exist until the Industrial Revolution makes large-scale institutional management a common practice. Yet here are these foundling hospitals, predating the Industrial Revolution, demonstrating the same organizational principles and design philosophies. It's like finding an Amazon fulfillment center from the 1700s, complete with optimized workflow and systematic processing of babies, which is a deeply uncomfortable comparison. But frankly, that's what these institutions were, fulfillment centers for the human population deficit. Now the question that should be screaming in your mind is, where did all these babies come from? Official histories explain that they were abandoned children, orphans, babies born to poor families who couldn't afford to raise them, illegitimate children whose mothers couldn't keep them. All of which is historically accurate. Abandonment of infants was tragically common in pre-modern societies due to poverty, social stigma, and the general harshness of life. But the sheer numbers don't add up. We're talking about tens of thousands of babies being deposited at these institutions annually across Europe. That's a staggering amount of abandonment. Either there was an unprecedented crisis of poverty and family breakdown happening simultaneously across the entire continent, or something else was going on. And here's where things get really weird. Demographic data from this period shows that urban population growth between 1720 and 1750 came disproportionately from these foundling home graduates, rather than from natural increase in existing families. In other words, cities weren't growing because families were having more babies that survived to adulthood. Cities were growing because foundling homes were pumping out adults at an industrial rate. Let's do some back-of-the-envelope math here, because the numbers are genuinely alarming. If you lose 40 million people from your population, and you need to replace them within a few decades to maintain civilization, you need an absolutely massive baby boom. Natural population replacement doesn't work that fast, especially after a catastrophe that presumably killed many people of childbearing age. Even with perfect conditions, unlimited food, no disease, everyone healthy and fertile, human reproduction has physical limits. Women can't just produce babies on demand like a factory assembly line. Pregnancy takes 9 months. Babies need years of care before they're functional members of society. And realistically, each woman can only have so many children in her lifetime. To replace 40 million people in 30 to 40 years through natural reproduction, you'd need essentially every woman of reproductive age to be constantly pregnant and successfully raising multiple children to adulthood. That's not realistic. It's mathematically improbable, even under ideal circumstances, and immediately post-catastrophe circumstances are never ideal. But if you have institutions that can raise tens of thousands of babies simultaneously, using systematic methods and advanced technology to maximize survival rates, suddenly the math starts working. You're not limited by the number of families willing and able to raise children. You're only limited by how many babies you can acquire and how many facilities you can operate. If your goal is rapid population replacement, centralized institutional child-rearing is actually the most efficient approach. It's cold, it's calculating, and it's exactly what you'd do if you were trying to rebuild human civilization after a catastrophe, and you needed to do it fast. The question is, who had the resources, knowledge, and authority to establish these institutions across multiple countries? Who was coordinating this effort? And most disturbingly, where were the babies actually coming from? The official records say the babies were abandoned by their mothers, but the documentation is often suspiciously vague about specifics. Many babies arrived with no identifying information, no family history, no explanation of their origins. They were just there. Anonymous infants appearing at the doors of foundling hospitals in numbers that strain credulity. Some institutions had turning wheels, or baby doors, specifically designed to allow anonymous drop-offs. Basically a lazy Susan built into the building where you could leave a baby, ring a bell, and walk away without being seen. While this was officially to protect the mother's identity and prevent infanticide, it also conveniently ensured there was no documentation of where these babies came from or who was depositing them. It's the perfect system if you want to introduce large numbers of babies into the population without questions being asked about their origins. Now, I'm not saying aliens were dropping off human babies at orphanages in the 1700s. What I am saying is that if you wanted to rapidly repopulate civilization after a catastrophe, and if you had access to advanced reproductive or life support technology from a previous civilization, establishing institutions that could raise babies at scale, while obscuring their origins, would be a logical strategy. Whether the babies were naturally born and collected from surviving populations, or whether some kind of advanced reproductive technology was involved, which sounds insane but is actually less implausible than you'd think given the other technological anomalies we've discussed, the result was the same. A generation of people with no family ties, no ancestral memory, no connection to whatever came before the catastrophe. They were blank slates, perfect for being educated in the new standardized system we talked about earlier, learning only what their caretakers wanted them to know about history and the world. The social impact of this system can't be overstated. When a significant portion of your population comes from institutions rather than families, you're fundamentally changing the nature of society. Family-based cultures pass down oral histories, traditions, memories, and skepticism of authority through generations. But institutionally raised children have no such continuity. They learn what they're taught, and only what they're taught. They have no grandmother telling them stories about the old days, no grandfather sharing skills and knowledge from his youth. Their entire understanding of the past comes from their institutional education. If you wanted to erase collective memory of a previous civilization and ensure the next generation accepted a new narrative without question, raising large numbers of children in controlled institutional environments would be remarkably effective. Within 1 or 2 generations, the organic transmission of cultural memory is broken, and the official narrative becomes the only narrative anyone knows. The long-term effects of these foundling homes on European society are still visible today, if you know where to look. Many modern social institutions, educational practices, and governmental approaches to child welfare trace their roots back to these 18th-century foundling hospitals. They established precedents for state involvement in child rearing, for institutional education, for systematic approaches to social welfare. They normalized the idea that raising children could be separated from traditional family structures and managed by centralized authorities. Whether this was an intentional program to reshape society or a practical response to demographic crisis, it fundamentally altered European civilization's trajectory. And it all happened right after our catastrophic reset period, which is either the biggest coincidence in history or evidence of coordinated social engineering on a civilizational scale. Let's also talk about the success rates of these institutions, because they're surprisingly good for what should have been incredibly challenging circumstances. Raising babies is hard. Raising thousands of babies in one facility without modern medicine, antibiotics, or advanced nutritional science should be nearly impossible. Infant mortality in the 18th century was horrifically high in normal families with dedicated parental care. Yet these foundling hospitals somehow managed to raise large numbers of children to adulthood despite the odds. Were they just incredibly lucky? Did they have exceptionally skilled caretakers? Or did they have access to knowledge and technology that shouldn't have existed, perhaps preserved from the pre-catastrophe civilization? The survival rates, while still terrible by modern standards, were good enough to accomplish their goal, rapidly increasing the population and getting civilization back on track. That suggests more than luck or good intentions. It suggests capability. So let's put all the pieces together now, because we've covered a lot of ground, and it's time to see what picture emerges when we step back and look at everything we've discovered. Around 1700, multiple simultaneous anomalies occur in the historical record. 40 million people disappear from demographic data across multiple continents. The climate experiences catastrophic disruption with darkened skies, frozen rivers in summer, and years of failed harvests. Advanced pre-1700 maps showing impossible accuracy suddenly become less precise, as if knowledge was lost. Major cities built on megalithic foundations demonstrating advanced engineering get buried under meters of sediment from catastrophic flooding. Basic technologies that had been practiced for centuries are mysteriously forgotten. Over 30 countries simultaneously reform their calendars, establishing new starting points for counting years. Standardized education systems appear globally with identical curricula and textbooks. Geological evidence shows a compressed sediment layer from massive flooding dating to 1680 to 1720. And finally, industrial-scale foundling hospitals appear across Europe, rapidly rebuilding the population through institutional child rearing rather than natural family growth. These aren't isolated historical quirks. These are symptoms of a single event or coordinated series of events that fundamentally disrupted and reset human civilization. The demographic collapse, the climate disaster, and the flooding fit together as a catastrophe that killed millions and buried existing infrastructure. The calendar reforms, the educational standardization, and the foundling home system fit together as a coordinated response to rebuild civilization under new management. The forgetting of technologies and the loss of map accuracy fit as side effects of the catastrophe destroying knowledge and killing skilled practitioners. When you look at all of this together, the conclusion is inescapable. Something world-changing happened around 1700, and somebody coordinated the response to it. The question is, who? Who had the capability to coordinate calendar reforms across dozens of countries that barely communicated with each other? Who had the resources to establish massive foundling hospitals with advanced technology across Europe simultaneously? Who had the authority to implement standardized education systems globally? Who decided what history would be taught and what would be forgotten? Official history provides no answer, because official history doesn't acknowledge that these coordinated actions occurred. But the evidence is clear. This wasn't random. This wasn't coincidence. This was orchestrated. Several possibilities present themselves, none of them comfortable. First possibility: a surviving elite from the pre-catastrophe civilization. If the catastrophe killed most of humanity, but a small group with advanced knowledge and resources survived, they would have the means and motivation to rebuild. They could use preserved technology to establish the foundling homes. They could coordinate the calendar reforms to establish a new starting point for their rebuilt world. They could control the narrative through standardized education to ensure the new generation never asked inconvenient questions about the past. This would explain the technological sophistication of certain aspects of the recovery and the coordinated nature of the response. It would make the reset deliberate, not just recovering from a disaster, but using the disaster as an opportunity to restructure human society according to their design. Second possibility: an external force or authority that saw the catastrophe as an opportunity to take control. This sounds like science fiction, but if we're entertaining impossible maps, advanced foundations, and industrial-scale baby-raising in the 1700s, we might as well consider all options. An external force with superior technology and organization could have used the chaos of the catastrophe to implement their own system of control. Establish new calendars, new education, new population, all under their supervision. This would explain the coordinated global nature of the response, despite the supposed lack of communication infrastructure to make such coordination possible. It would also explain why the historical record is so carefully curated. Whoever was in charge wanted to ensure their narrative was the only narrative. Third possibility: the catastrophe itself was engineered. What if the climate disaster, the flooding, and the population collapse weren't natural? What if they were the result of warfare or sabotage using advanced technology from a previous civilization? Nuclear weapons can create nuclear winter. Geoengineering experiments can catastrophically alter climate. Massive construction projects or resource extraction could trigger tectonic events. If competing factions within an advanced civilization went to war, the results could easily look like natural disaster to survivors who didn't understand the technology being used. The aftermath, with its coordinated rebuilding and careful control of information, would then make sense as the winning faction, establishing their version of civilization on the ruins of the old world. Fourth possibility, and perhaps the most disturbing: the reset was intentional and cyclical. What if human civilization periodically reaches a certain level of development and then gets deliberately reset by an authority that wants to maintain control, keep humanity at a manageable technological level, prevent them from developing capabilities that might threaten the control system, and periodically wipe the slate clean when things get too advanced? The 1700 event would just be the most recent reset, with others occurring throughout history but being similarly erased from collective memory. This would explain why so many ancient civilizations show evidence of sophisticated knowledge and capability that then mysteriously disappears. They all hit the reset button and had to start over, with each iteration thinking it was the first. Or maybe the simplest explanation is true. A natural catastrophe occurred, it was genuinely devastating, and the survivors did their best to rebuild with whatever resources and knowledge they had. The coordination we see might be less sinister than it appears. Perhaps a shared human response to shared trauma, with communities independently arriving at similar solutions because those solutions were effective. The calendar reforms might have been necessary because the climate disaster genuinely disrupted seasonal patterns, making old calendars useless. The educational standardization might have emerged naturally as regions sharing technology and resources also shared teaching materials. The foundling homes might have been a practical response to massive orphan populations after the catastrophe. Under this interpretation, there's no conspiracy, no hidden authority, just human resilience and adaptation in the face of disaster. But here's the problem with the simple explanation. It doesn't account for the erasure. If this was just natural disaster and recovery, why isn't it the central event in the 18th century history? Why are there so few primary sources describing the catastrophe? Why do the standardized textbooks that appeared afterward specifically avoid detailed discussion of the pre-1700 period? Why does the official historical narrative treat all these simultaneous anomalies as unconnected coincidences rather than symptoms of a unified event? The simplest explanation only works if we ignore the systematic nature of the historical amnesia surrounding this period. Someone decided what we would know and what we would forget. Someone established the educational system that taught subsequent generations their understanding of history. Someone controlled the narrative. Whether that someone was a coordinated group of survivors, a hidden authority, an external force, or just the inevitable process of history being written by those who survive to tell the tale. The effect is the same. We don't know the truth about the 17th century. We don't know what really happened. We don't know how many people died or how they died. We don't know what knowledge was lost. We don't know who rebuilt our world or why they chose to rebuild it the way they did. And that brings us to the uncomfortable present. If something this significant could be erased from history, if 40 million people could disappear, cities could be buried, technologies could be forgotten, and the entire event could be obscured within a few generations, what else don't we know? What other resets might have occurred? How much of what we think we understand about human history is actually accurate, versus being carefully curated narrative designed to prevent us from asking certain questions? The physical evidence is still there. The sediment layers, the buried buildings, the impossible maps, the megalithic foundations. But the story of what created that evidence has been lost or deliberately obscured. We are, in a very real sense, amnesiacs living in a civilization that forgot its own past. We know something catastrophic happened because we can see the scars in the archaeological record, in the demographic data, in the synchronization of institutions that shouldn't have been able to coordinate. But we don't know the details. We don't know who we really are or where we came from. We don't know if we're living in the natural evolution of human civilization or in a carefully managed recovery from disaster. We don't know if we're free agents writing our own history or following a script someone else established during the 1700s reset. The evidence we've examined throughout this investigation all points to one conclusion. The late 17th and early 18th centuries were not just another period of history. They were a hinge point, a reset, a deliberate re-engineering of human civilization. Whether that reset was done by surviving humans, external forces, or some combination thereof, it reshaped our world and established the foundations of modern society. The population we descend from, the education systems we inherited, the historical narratives we accept, the very calendar we use to count our years, all of it traces back to decisions made by whoever orchestrated the post-catastrophe reconstruction. And here's the truly unsettling part. If they could reset civilization once, they could do it again. The technology and knowledge to establish foundling hospitals, coordinate global calendar reforms, standardize education, and control historical narrative. That capability doesn't just disappear. If it existed in 1700, some version of it presumably exists now, possibly more advanced, possibly more subtle. Are we heading toward another reset? Have we already passed the threshold that triggered the last one? Is our current climate crisis, our demographic challenges, our technological acceleration bringing us toward another intentional or natural reset point? We don't know. We can't know, because we don't understand what happened last time. The architects of the 1700s reset did their job well. They erased the memory of what came before, established a new narrative, and created a civilization that would accept that narrative without question. Most people go their entire lives without ever wondering why there's a strange sediment layer under their city, or where all those babies in foundling hospitals really came from, or why maps from 1600 are more accurate than maps from 1750. They accept the official history because it's all they've ever been taught, and questioning it requires noticing anomalies that you've been educated not to see. But now you've seen them. You've seen the demographic impossibility, the climate evidence, the geological proof of flooding, the technological forgetting, the calendar synchronization, the educational coordination, and the industrial-scale population replacement. You've seen that all of these supposedly unconnected events cluster around the year 1700. You've seen that the official explanation for each individual anomaly fails to account for the pattern they formed together. You've seen that something happened, something big, something that changed everything. The question is, what are you going to do with this knowledge? You can accept the official narrative and dismiss all of this as coincidence and conspiracy theory. That's the easy path, the comfortable path, the path you've been educated to take. Or you can look at the evidence, trust your own reasoning, and accept that human history is weirder, darker, and more mysterious than we've been told. Accept that we're living in a post-reset civilization, one that began roughly 300 years ago with a catastrophe we barely remember and a reconstruction we didn't consent to. Accept that the foundations of our world, literally and figuratively, were laid by people or entities whose motives and identities remain obscure. I can't tell you what happened for certain. Nobody can, because the truth was deliberately buried under layers of sediment, calendar reforms, standardized education, and historical amnesia. What I can tell you is that the evidence exists, it's consistent, and it points to something far stranger than the neat, progressive narrative of human history we learn in school. We're not the natural culmination of thousands of years of gradual development. We're the descendants of a population replacement program, educated in a standardized system, counting our years on reformed calendars, living in cities built on buried foundations of civilizations we're not supposed to remember. The architects of our amnesia succeeded brilliantly. They reset the clock, rebuilt the world, and ensured we wouldn't question the origins of our civilization. But they couldn't erase the physical evidence. The mud layer is still there. The buried buildings still exist. The Foundling Hospital records survived. The impossible maps remain in museums. The calendar reforms are documented. The evidence is all around us, waiting for anyone who bothers to look closely enough to notice that the official story doesn't add up. So here we are, 325 years after the reset, finally starting to ask the questions we should have been asking all along. Who are we? Where did we come from? What happened to the world that existed before 1700? Who rebuilt our civilization and why? What knowledge was lost, and what was deliberately suppressed? Are we free, or are we living in the managed aftermath of a catastrophe we're not allowed to remember? I don't have all the answers. Maybe nobody does. Maybe the truth was lost along with those 40 million missing people. Or maybe someone knows. Maybe the descendants of whoever orchestrated the reset are still around, still managing things, still making sure we don't dig too deep into questions about the 1700s. Either way, we're living in a world built on mysteries, governed by a history we can't fully trust, counting our years on a calendar that was reset by people whose names we don't know for reasons they never explain. The only thing I know for certain is this: we were not told the truth. About the 1700s, about the catastrophe, about who rebuilt our world and why. We were given a story, a clean narrative that glosses over the anomalies and ignores the evidence. And for 300 years, we believed it. But the evidence is still there, buried but not destroyed, obscured but not eliminated. And now that you've seen it, you can't unsee it. Welcome to the uncomfortable truth about human history. We're amnesiacs living on the ruins of a world we've forgotten, built by architects whose identity remains one of history's best-kept secrets. The question isn't whether a reset happened. The evidence makes that clear. The question is, what are we going to do now that we know?